Good afternoon. If I could get your attention, we'd like to go ahead and begin. As with everything in Washington, there is much to talk about and very little time in which to do it. And we are so appreciative of so many of you coming to attend today's symposium. A couple of logistical matters. As much as we'd like to talk about rule of law, we sometimes have to rule by law. And in the spirit of that, we have to keep things moving, both because of our tightly packed schedule and because the Wilson Center has a number of competing events. So we will usher you out of this room certainly as easily as we can. So we encourage you to munch on your food as we deliver a few lunch remarks, and then we will be whisked away back to the auditorium to continue the conversation, to continue discussions about topics such as sustainability. Before we do, and as you complete your lunches, I'd like to introduce Neil Levine, who is the director of the Center of Excellence for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Prior to this august stint in the U.S. government, he was an assistant professor of behavioral science at the National Defense University, Eisenhower School of National Security and Resource Strategy, and was an adjunct professor in the School of International Service at American University. His experience is long and robust, his responsibilities are tremendous, and we are greatly pleased to have him join us today to give us a perspective in many ways about where the origins of our work are, and more importantly, to also think about the drive that motivates so many of us in this room to do what we do and to persist in the work that we call rule of law. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Levine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamid. I really want to congratulate Just Track and the Wilson Center for this turnout. It's really phenomenal, and I really had a chance to look at some of the participant list, and I think I am going to be able to qualify for continuing legal education credit with just these brief remarks. I understand that you have a tight schedule. It's a demonstration of ordered liberty, so enjoy your lunch, but you're going to be out of here before you know it. What I'd like to do is, looking at your schedule, it looks like you are kind of intensely involved, and as is in your discipline, for many of you, a case study methodology was employed. And so what I'd like to do in my remarks is sort of just give you a perspective coming from AID, to pull back a little bit, to set the context into which much of this work occurs, what the setting here in Washington is for the immediate 6-month perspective, as that is kind of signaled by the calendar, and then looking broader out, what are the broader trends that we're dealing with, both as AID, as a development agency, but as someone who's involved in both issues affecting democracy, human rights, and governance, but also more specifically rule of law. To talk about those trends, and then stop the remarks and really take questions or hear comments and see what you see in the world. Thank you for your warm welcome. I see many familiar faces, longtime colleagues and friends, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Joel Samuels, to Hamid Khan, and Will Pomerantz, our hosts here, for just an excellent program. And also, I just want to say a little bit about interagency collaboration. We're here with interagency partners, most particularly the Department of State, Justice, and others. And across town, this is the week that we gather our cadre of close to 100 democracy, human rights, and governance officers, along with a coterie of interagency colleagues, as well as our implementing community, about roughly 375 folks across town. But why I'm here is that when you talk about the rule of law, sector, it really is shared space. And I think we can only succeed in partnership with the interagency and, more importantly, with the implementing community, and that would include the academic community, international organizations, and the like. These problems are so steep, they are so complex. There are resources throughout that community. And so I think what I like to say is, like, there's no place else that we need to be right now, and that includes me to have the chance to address you today. So with that, let me both commend the Just Track program, University of South Carolina, and the Woodrow Wilson Center for bringing you all together. And I'm sure you'll have a productive morning and a productive afternoon as soon as I stop talking. So let me, the three topics I wanted to talk about, kind of the week in Washington, what I call the next 6 months will be critical, and then looking further ahead, trends in the DRG sector and what it means to rule of law players and to Just Track. In terms of the week in Washington, I mean, incredible headlines, and the question is, either it's Armageddon and the end of the world, or it's sort of please take a breath, check your stock portfolio, but things will course correct down the road. I mean, the headlines are truly inflammatory about the end of Western democracy as you know it, or reading beyond that headline, you find is that the Brits have a particularly deep political, economic challenge that they have to work through. It is historic, but no doubt, but it also is, not beyond the imagination that they will figure out how to resolve and work their way through this. But there really is the language and the hyperbole over this. I don't know where you all come out, but this is the second day of the crisis, so I think hopefully cooler heads and voting patterns will take place. As I said, across town, we had our partners forum. We did have the opportunity to hear from our administrator, Gail Smith, on her take on the world, and I'd like to kind of share some of the perspectives that she offered our cadre. We had a collaboration last week with Just Track, where they participate in the training of our officers. So again, this theme of interagency collaboration. And then the last note about this week is that Gail has been asked by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to testify on corruption, the outcomes of the London summit, and where we're going next. This is a particular interest of Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, who is, if he has not already, about to introduce a piece of legislation that would, in essence, rank and rate countries around the world in terms of their performance in anti-corruption. His model for this is the counter-trafficking in persons regime that's there, which on the one hand would bring needed attention and oxygen to, I think, an issue from the development side we think is critical. Excuse me. At the same time, is the name and shaming of those countries going to be the most helpful and most effective way? And so Gail walks into that situation on Thursday. We've been involved in the preparation of that, but it really speaks to, I think, one of the trends in terms of the salience of the anti-corruption issue, both for the broader development community, but most particularly for the rule of law sector and the work that you all do. So that's this week. So let's pull back a little bit more and talk about the next 6 months. Many of you are creatures of Washington. You like the turning of the leaves. You know what the season is right now. Within a month, we'll have both political conventions. Excuse me. We'll have both political conventions. We'll have a furious race to the end of the fiscal year, and then we will have, in essence, the preparation for the transition and the incoming of the next administration. So Gail has been very good about kind of setting an agenda for us. She has sat down with most of the major initiative holders within AID and asked 3 questions. Number 1, what is it you're doing? Catch me up. I've been out of the agency for 20 years. We have the advantage of somebody who knows this field with true expertise, both from the field and from the Washington, and most directly from working directly with the president on development issues. Tell me, catch me up, what are you doing? The next is, what can I do over the next 6 months to lock in the initiatives that the Obama administration has put in place? And then lastly, what are issues that I can tee up for the next administration on things that we would like to see continued or problems that they are going to inherit, and what is our best thinking? And as a public servant, this is one of the most heady times to sort of be given the license to think broadly, to think strategically, looking down the road. Lift your work up from your everyday challenges and think about what's to come. And based on your experience, what is the best advice you can give to the new political leadership? And so we've had the opportunity to sit with Gail now twice, 2 of 3 brainstorms. The third brainstorm is really about global trends, what we see coming and what we should do about it. So just to cover some of the things that we're working on is if you had to look out on the horizon in the DRG space and think about what has been the most pressing issue, I had a chance to meet and catch up with Ambassador Tony Wayne, who saw the first wave of democracy in the 1990s and working in Eastern Europe. And, that's a very different world than what we face today, where Freedom House, as one of the folks who track this, says for the 9th straight year, we have more countries backsliding than advancing in democratic practice. Our partner, the International Center for Nonprofit Law, has documented 70 laws that have been passed that restrict civil society space in countries around the world. People refer to it, Tom Carruthers has written about kind of the democracy recession. And this is really a combination of factors, but the idea is that, democracy is now seen as not delivering in a way that is satisfying folks around the world after, about 20 years since the what they call the third wave of democracy. And you see this both in harsh negative and authoritarian responses, but you also see some breakthroughs in places like Guatemala, in a successful election in Nigeria, and you also see breakthroughs in countries that we didn't expect, Sri Lanka or Burma. And so, but in response to that, the president launched an initiative called the Stand with Civil Society Initiative, which is really our effort to identify with the aspirations of civil society under threat in so many countries around the world, a three-pronged approach that talked about enhanced diplomatic work, multilateral work to support civil society, and then new innovations and programs that would support civil society where it was more and more difficult to work. And there's an intersection in the countries that you work in, the countries that that we find under threat from closing political space. The AID's role in that is to create a series of regional civil society innovation hubs around the world where civil society can go for places of solidarity, for networking with like-minded institutions to generate ideas, and ultimately to generate proposals for funding in an area where the terrain around them has changed largely. Many of you will be familiar with some of the initiatives, what we call global governance initiatives, the Open Government Partnership. We spent a lot of time across town talking about the opportunities presented by what I heard referred to for the first time as the openness movement. And again, the intersections between rule of law in places like freedom of information, in terms of legal access, and broadening the scope of those countries that are working together for a true race to the top. With folks, how many of you are familiar or have heard of the Open Government Partnership? Okay, so, a voluntary organization of about 70 organizations. It started with about 8, 6 years ago, and it really is a new way of doing business. It is governments coming together with civil society, agreeing to action plans, and then agreeing to peer reviews by civil society and by each other to enhance performance. A snapshot today would tell you that there is among those 70 countries, there are countries that are truly engaged at the top as a race to the top. There are countries at the bottom who have no earthly business being in an open government partnership. They're doing it for reputational gains. And then there's countries in the middle where all of us work, which are really stuck. either for deficits of capacity or problems with political will, but really are interested in improving the ability of governments to deliver for their citizens. And then I think the most global, most ambitious of the global governance initiatives is the global agreement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And for this community, Goal 16 that talks about more just, more peaceful societies, accountable institutions. And the challenge there is this massive global, very ambitious agreement for justice for all everywhere. Which really takes you back to the kind of ambition that we saw embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter. And it sets a goal which I think is incredibly ambitious, incredibly important, articulated in a universal way, in that we in the United States have just as much to do to perfect our union, to deal with issues of access to legal justice, to police use of deadly force, to other areas where we are still have work to do as we go around the world and try to help others who are dealing with more fundamental and foundational development issues in the area of accountable and effective institutions. The struggle that we have right now is this lofty cosmic goal and then implementation that goes on all over the world in all different formats by many different actors, and how do we bring some kind of logic and some kind of coherence to that. And that is really the debate that's going on in places like New York, in Paris, in most of the donor capitals, as well as new places like the Open Government Partnership and, of course, the emerging, what we would call non-traditional donors and the BRICS. So a very interesting and different operating environment. And fundamental to that change in the environment is where are donor resources, or where are the resources coming from these days? 20 years ago, we could talk about official development assistance as being the driving force, the engine of that's where the resources are. That is now a minority share. It really is foreign investment, domestically generated resources, and then ODA. And so what has to change about our model when we're no longer the driving force of where those resources are coming from? Lastly, just preparing for the next administration. I guess I've been through 1, 2, 3. It's been my third, fourth? I think my third. And it really, as I said before, it really is interesting to say what questions we're asking is how do we institutionalize the Stand with Civil Society? What is the next step for the Open Government Partnership? Where should we head in dealing with issues like closing space? But pulling back, and this will be the last set of issues I want to talk about, is what are some of the trends and what are some of the implications for working in both rule of law, democracy, human rights, and governance? We've talked a little bit about closing space. We talked a little bit about open government. What about what we're calling under the rubric of people on the move? By official estimates, about 60 million people around the world classified as refugees and or internally displaced persons. What does that mean? What we see it cropping up in terms of our work in elections, where country after country, not only do you have to think about how to support actors on the ground in administering an election, voter education, turnout, what do you do when a sizable part of that population is living in a neighboring country or not living in their place of residence? How do they get documented? How does that? That's a very practical, when I ask our partners what keeps them up at night, it is out-of-country voting and voters on the move. That is a new fixture, I think, in the environment. People on the move also would talk about rural to urban migration, and the fact that we used to talk about in the early days of the Afghanistan-Iraq conflict as ungoverned spaces, thinking of vast border areas where there's lawlessness, and it is also inhospitable for lots of unsavory characters. What happens when ungoverned space is a part of a city, where there is no rule of law or access to justice or cities? So that's one issue. The kind of basket of fragility, conflict, and countering violent extremism. This one, just to, we are using polling technology. I think that you've been using this as well here to crowdsource and get instant feedback. We crowdsource what are the topics and where do you want to have the conversations this week in the DRG space. Top polling answer was countering violent extremism. Our democracy officers and implementing community are dealing with dealing with is how do we retool or redirect our traditional development programs to deal with either the fragile states and crises there, or very real problems of countering violent extremism without rebranding everything we do and calling it countering violent extremism, or really how do you do thoughtful programming to look at underlying causes of those conditions that extreme ideologies can prey upon, making folks sources of recruitment. So that basket of issue. Second, two more trends: globalization and the technology-empowered citizen. Again, Ambassador Wayne and I talked about what are some of the differences now. Is that we saw from the Arab Spring to Guatemala to Brazil that each of these crises or events now have the capacity to take on a life of their own because of the 24-hour news cycle, the fact that folks are linked, they can organize, they can get solidarity from abroad, and that this is occurring in real time. And so you have a very fast-moving movement of at times, and you have the old, 19th century nation state lumbering to catch up of these events. And so what does that mean? Both kind of the two-edged sword of a technologically empowered citizen who can demand accountability and take more agency in their rights and as citizens, and then kind of the more nefarious uses of technology for things like surveillance and kind of capture. The last of particular interest to us, but overlaps into the sphere of rule of law work, is kind of the demographics of poverty. Right now, the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals aim to eradicate extreme poverty by the year 2050, and that seems to be a goal within our reach. But where is poverty today? It happens to be in large middle-income countries with large amounts of poor people, and then deep pockets of poverty in fragile states, which are some of the most difficult environments both for us to work and to get results for investments of foreign assistance. What does that mean for AID? I'll speak broadly about this in terms of kind of to start a response, and then I hope to kind of engage you in what your ideas about what it means, and also any trends that I might not have mentioned. I think as development professionals and as folks who are trained to take a long-term perspective, we really start with kind of a basket of issues about analytics, data, and learning, in terms of look at this remarkably complex array of problems we're facing, and are our analytics, or do we have the right mental constructs, do we have the right frameworks, and do we have ways of collecting data and to appropriately assess that problem? And when I say we, I really think I need to ask is not only does this room need that, but we need a way to engage our local partners to see the world as they see it, and to be listening to what they feel are the directions that they should move forward. But that's part of the data and the learning that we need to do. A lot of discussion about adaptive programming. We are largely facing a very, very complex world with means of programming that are 20, 30, or 40 years old. They are the world of grants and contracts. And while there has been some innovation, and there are some places where you see real bright spots in terms of changing that, I think there has to be a fundamental rethink that the tools in which we engage have to be responsive to the phenomenon themselves. They need to be much more adaptive, much more flexible, much more timely. And we have a system that is not constructed with that in mind at all. And so that, I think, is probably the biggest challenge. The third area would be partnerships, partly because we have a lumbering and non-agile system. We really have to think more creatively about If we can't bring our resources to bear, who can? And how do we empower other partners, whether they are local partners, whether they are international organizations, whether they are other donors, whether they are social movements. We just have to think much more broadly about with whom we partner and how. I have not said up until this remark, this is probably a record in Washington, I haven't said anything about money and resources. And we can talk about the budget forecast, but let's just to say is that all of these things cost money. One of the criticisms of the administration has been we not have paid sufficient attention with the kind of resources we need for robust programming in DRG. That's changing now, I think, and I can talk to you about where I see that's going, but folks talk about we need data. Data costs money. We need to learn. Learning costs money. It costs money and it costs time. We need to coordinate better. That takes time. So to say that this is free is to kind of misunderstand the situation. And then what does this mean, and this kind of hits home to many of you, is about your own business models. What is the kind of training, the kind of ways that the implementing community operates in response to these trends? I just would submit that the way we're doing business now has got to change because the problems around us and the atmosphere that we face is changing rapidly. So let me stop there. We do have a hard, they're going to sweep us out of here at 2:15, so we're done. And with that, we're swept. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Neil, rule by law. So I just want to note one thing to the query that Aid made with regarding to the question posed by program officers back in the field about counter-violent extremism. Actually, JustTrack just completed a symposium in Dubai that brought together worldwide experts on both counter-violent extremism and the Middle East, and we're in the process of publishing the recommendations on that, and that will be on the JustTrack website. Now I have the unfortunate news of ushering you out of this room because we need to make a quick transition for the next event and for our event to culminate back in the auditorium. And please stick for the last panel. Thank you. Yeah. Freneticism, law and order.